Welcome to this journey of one of the most disturbing cases in recorded history of Louisiana. Before we begin, I invite you to leave a comment about where you're watching from and the exact time you heard this story. We're interested in knowing where and at what times of day or night these documented accounts arrive. Tonight we delve into the forgotten records of Ellerslie Plantation in St. Francisville, West Feliciana Parish, Louisiana. What began as research into antebellum marriage customs in 1856 revealed a darkness that challenges our understanding of human cruelty. The documents you'll hear about tonight were sealed in the Louisiana State Archives until 1962, when historian Dr. Margaret Wilborn uncovered them during research for her never-published doctoral thesis. 3 months after her discovery, she abandoned her academic career without explanation. The records were subsequently reclassified and remained untouched until portions were microfilmed for preservation in 1968. The story centers around Ellerslie Plantation and the Blackwood family, whose wealth from cotton and sugar production made them influential figures in Louisiana society. While bride auctions among the enslaved population were not uncommon in the antebellum South, what transpired at Ellerslie defied conventional understanding of even these brutal practices. The events were documented in fragments through plantation ledgers, correspondence between neighboring estate owners, and the partial journal of Josephine Blackwood, wife of plantation owner Thaddeus Blackwood. What happened during the summer of 1856 at Ellerslie was systematically erased from the local memory. The plantation house still stands today, though it passed through 7 owners in the decade following the events. Local records note that none resided there for more than 14 months. The last attempt at restoration was abandoned in 1967. According to parish records, Thaddeus Blackwood purchased Ellerslie in 1847 after amassing considerable wealth through cotton speculation in Mississippi. The plantation was modest by regional standards, 400 acres with a Greek Revival main house that had fallen into disrepair under its previous owner. Blackwood immediately began renovations, expanding the main residence and adding distinctive architectural elements that drew attention from architectural enthusiasts throughout the region. Most notable was the unusual octagonal study he had constructed as an addition to the east wing, featuring floor-to-ceiling windows and a domed ceiling with a complex pattern of wooden inlays. Blackwood's background before his arrival in Louisiana remains oddly obscured in historical records. Documents suggest he claimed to have studied medicine in Philadelphia and Paris, though no record of his attendance exists at any medical institution in either city. Local physicians noted his extensive knowledge of anatomy and chemistry, often consulting him on difficult cases. Dr. Samuel Claiborne, whose practice served most of the plantation families in the parish, wrote in his medical diary that Blackwood possesses insights into human physiology that surpass even those taught at the most advanced medical colleges, though his interests seem to lie less in healing than in understanding the mechanisms of human development and inheritance. Josephine Mercer came from a prominent Charleston family that had lost much of its fortune in a banking collapse of 1839. Their marriage in 1850 was arranged through family connections, a common practice among the plantation aristocracy. Early correspondence between the newlyweds, preserved in the Mercer family archives in South Carolina, suggests a cordial, if not passionate, relationship. Josephine wrote to her cousin in 1851, "Mr. Blackwood is attentive and generous, if somewhat distant in his affections. His mind seems perpetually occupied with matters he does not share, though he assures me they are of great importance to our future prosperity." The couple's social standing in St. Francisville society was initially strong. Parish records show Thaddeus served on various civic committees, made substantial donations to the Episcopal Church, and hosted seasonal gatherings at Ellerslie that were well attended by neighboring planters and their families. Josephine was known for her musical talents, particularly her skill with the pianoforte, and her gardens at Ellerslie were frequently mentioned in local social columns. However, visitors often remarked on the unusual silence that pervaded the household, the absence of the casual conversation and laughter typical of plantation homes of the era. Elizabeth Pembroke, whose family owned neighboring Willow Creek Plantation, wrote to her sister in Baton Rouge in 1852, "The Blackwoods maintain all proper appearances, yet there is a stillness about their home that unsettles me. The servants move like shadows, speaking only when addressed directly. Even the birds seem to avoid the oak grove surrounding the main house. Josephine plays beautifully at the pianoforte, yet her eyes rarely match the liveliness of the music." Ellerslie's agricultural operations were efficiently managed and profitable, focusing on cotton and sugar cane. The plantation's ledgers, now held in the Louisiana State Archives, show meticulous record-keeping and steadily increasing yields from 1847 to 1855. Unlike many neighboring plantations that expanded primarily through the acquisition of additional land, Blackwood focused on maximizing production through what he termed methodical improvement of resources, including early experiments with crop rotation and irrigation techniques that were unusual for the period. The turning point at Ellerslie appears to have begun in late 1855. According to records from the New Orleans Mercantile Library, Blackwood made several visits to the city between November 1855 and January 1856, where he spent considerable time reviewing scientific journals and medical texts. The library's sign-in records show particular interest in European publications on heredity and animal husbandry. He corresponded with several physicians and natural philosophers in Europe, requesting specific texts on the emerging theories of inheritance. A letter from Dr. Heinrich Müller of Vienna, dated December 12, 1855, and preserved in the Louisiana Historical Society collection, responds to Blackwood's inquiries. "Your theories regarding the transmission of non-physical traits through bloodlines are intriguing if somewhat beyond current scientific consensus. The experiments you propose would certainly yield valuable data, though I caution that such investigations into human heredity must remain theoretical rather than practical, given the obvious moral considerations." Josephine's journal entries from January 1856 reveal a woman increasingly isolated. "The walls of Ellerslie seem to close in more each day," she wrote. "Thaddeus spends his evenings in the study, the scratching of his pen audible until dawn. When he emerges, his eyes hold something I dare not name." Local physician Dr. Samuel Claiborne noted in his records that he treated Mrs. Blackwood for nervous exhaustion 4 times in the spring of 1856, prescribing laudanum that, according to her journal, barely dulls the sounds that travel upward through the floorboards after midnight. On January 18, 1856, Josephine wrote, "Thaddeus has begun construction of what he terms a special project in the old indigo processing building. Workmen from Baton Rouge arrive and depart in darkness, and none are from firms I recognize. When I inquired about the nature of the renovations, he smiled in that peculiar way that never reaches his eyes, and said only that it was a laboratory for the advancement of knowledge. He has forbidden me from approaching the building." The Blackwoods' nearest neighbors, the Pembrokes of Willow Creek Plantation 3 miles east, noted in correspondence that the Blackwoods had become increasingly reclusive. "It has been near 3 months since we've seen either of them at service," wrote Elizabeth Pembroke to her sister in Baton Rouge. "When I called upon Josephine last Tuesday, the house had a stillness that unsettled me deeply. The curtains were drawn despite the fine weather, and she received me in the parlor without once removing her gloves, even as tea was served." According to records from neighboring plantations, Thaddeus Blackwood began acquiring additional enslaved persons in February 1856, focusing exclusively on unmarried women between the ages of 18 and 25. The official ledgers listed these purchases as domestic staff, despite Ellerslie already maintaining a full household. Over the course of 3 months, he acquired 17 women from various auction houses across Louisiana and Mississippi, far more than the operation of Ellerslie would require. A shipping manifest from the New Orleans docks dated February 27, 1856, lists delivery to Ellerslie of several large crates marked medical apparatus and laboratory equipment imported from Germany. The customs declaration describes the contents as instruments for scientific inquiry, but provides no further details. The manifest notes that the shipment was personally received by Blackwood rather than plantation staff, unusual for deliveries of that size. Josephine's journal entry from March 3, 1856, reads, "I woke in the night to find Thaddeus's side of the bed empty. From the window I observed lanterns moving between the main house and the old Indigo building. When he returned near dawn, his clothes carried the scent of chemicals I could not identify, and he would not meet my eyes at breakfast. When I mentioned hearing a woman's voice calling out in the night, he informed me that I had been dreaming and suggested that perhaps my laudanum dosage should be increased." The hidden ledger discovered in 1964 tells a different story from the official plantation records. Entries in Thaddeus Blackwood's distinctive handwriting detail what he called compatibility assessments and breeding potential evaluations. These clinical descriptions were interspersed with passages in what appears to be cipher or code, which linguistic experts at Tulane University partially decoded in 1965 before abruptly terminating their analysis. The three scholars involved refused to continue the project, citing ethical concerns regarding the material. The decoded portion suggests that Blackwood was conducting what he termed selective pairings based on criteria that went beyond the conventional brutal pragmatism of enslavers. He wrote of bloodlines, inheritance of temperament, and generational improvements. One particularly disturbing entry from March 27, 1856 reads, "Subject 12 displays the melancholy disposition I have been seeking. Her eyes hold the appropriate vacancy after 3 days in the lower chamber. She will be prepared for the May ceremony." An entry dated March 30th describes, "The preparation chamber is now fully operational." The introduction of the gaseous compound produces the desired effect of increased suggestibility without compromising cognitive function. Subjects 7 through 14 have responded as theorized to the auditory conditioning, though Subject 9 showed unexpected resistance and has been relegated to standard field work. The remaining subjects now respond appropriately to the bell sequence and enter the trance state within 45 seconds of initiation. Parish records indicate unusual purchases by Blackwood during this period, including large quantities of ether, chloroform, and various mineral compounds from apothecaries in New Orleans, Baton Rouge, and as far away as Memphis. A receipt dated April 2, 1856, from Lafitte's Chemical Supply in New Orleans lists substances typically used only by physicians or universities, along with specialized glassware and precision scales. The proprietor added a handwritten note, "Dr. Blackwood, I have procured the requested European journals per your inquiry. Their contents are quite advanced, and I must say, controversial in nature. I trust your research is proceeding satisfactorily." In April 1856, Blackwood began sending unusual invitations to select plantation owners across 3 parishes. These invitations, preserved in the collection of the Louisiana Historical Society, invited discerning gentlemen of vision to Ellerslie for what was described as an exclusive opportunity to secure advantageous marital arrangements. The gathering was scheduled for May 15, 1856, and requested absolute discretion from all attendees. The invitation text, printed on heavy cream stationery with Blackwood's personal seal, read, "You are cordially invited to participate in a scientific and social advancement opportunity at Ellerslie Plantation on the evening of May 15, 1856. Dr. Thaddeus Blackwood has perfected a method of selection and preparation that ensures optimal compatibility and desirable inherited traits. This exclusive gathering will present unique specimens for matrimonial arrangements with documented lineage and proven temperamental characteristics. Investment in these scientifically arranged unions promises significant returns for the discerning planter concerned with the quality of future generations. Strictest confidentiality is expected. Josephine's journal entries become increasingly fragmented during this period. I hear them weeping through the walls, she wrote on April 23rd. Thaddeus says it is merely the settling of the house, but a house does not beg for mercy in the night. On May 1st, she wrote only, "He has moved them to the old indigo processing building. The singing has stopped." On May 7th, she wrote, "I followed him tonight, keeping to the shadows as he walked the path to the indigo building. Through a crack in the boarded window, I observed what I can scarcely describe. The interior has been transformed into some manner of laboratory, with strange brass instruments and glass containers connected by rubber tubing. The women were seated in a circle, unmoving, their eyes fixed on a swinging pendulum as Thaddeus spoke in a low, rhythmic tone. When he struck a small silver bell, they responded in unison, speaking phrases I could not comprehend. I fled before he could discover my presence, but I fear he knows I have seen." Her entry from May 10th reads simply, "He has begun locking my door at night. The key to my medicine cabinet is missing. I have hidden these pages beneath the loose floorboard by the armoire." According to the fragmentary records available, 12 men from prominent plantations arrived at Ellerslie on the evening of May 15th. No wives or other family members accompanied them. The gathering was not listed in any social register, despite the prominence of those in attendance. A receipt from New Orleans shows that Blackwood had ordered 24 bottles of rare French champagne and engaged a small orchestra from Baton Rouge for the evening. The estate's temporary staff for the evening included French chef Auguste Devereaux, brought from New Orleans specifically for the occasion. In an 1876 interview with the New Orleans Picayune conducted shortly before his death, Devereaux recalled, "In my 50 years of culinary service, I have never witnessed such a strange gathering. The gentlemen dined at a table set with the finest silver and crystal, yet their conversation was clinical, detached, more like physicians at a medical conference than guests at a social function. Dr. Blackwood made a toast I shall never forget. To the future we design rather than the one we inherit." The women were not present during dinner, but I glimpsed them in an adjoining room as I served the final course, seated motionless in white dresses, staring forward as though entranced. What transpired that night was partially recorded in a letter sent by attendee Colonel James Harrington to his cousin in Virginia, intercepted and preserved in the personal collection of the postmaster of St. Francisville, who apparently never delivered it. The letter, dated May 18, 1856, describes the evening in measured terms that barely conceal the writer's discomfort. The affair Blackwood arranged was unlike anything I have witnessed in 30 years as a planter. The women were presented not as property alone, but as vessels for what our host repeatedly termed the advancement of controlled lineage. They stood silent in white dresses, arranged before us like some manner of exhibition. Blackwood spoke at length of his research and selective processes, using terminology more suited to horse breeding than human concerns. Several gentlemen departed before the bidding commenced, though I confess I remained, partly from curiosity, and partly from a strange compulsion I cannot adequately explain. When the woman identified as Specimen 8 was brought forward, I observed markings upon her wrists that suggested long restraint, and a vacancy in her expression that indicated she had been administered some manner of sedative. I made my excuses shortly thereafter. Harrington's letter continues. Most disturbing was not the auction itself, which differed only in terminology from practices common throughout the South, but rather the detailed documentation Blackwood provided to potential buyers. Each woman was accompanied by what he termed a lineage portfolio, containing observations about her family dating back 3 generations, detailed physical measurements presented in scientific notation, and strangest of all predictions about the temperament and capabilities of potential offspring resulting from the union. Blackwood referred repeatedly to his conditioning protocol that would ensure the women's compliance and receptivity. When questioned about his methods, He became evasive, stating only that he had developed techniques to influence inherited characteristics through environmental manipulation. I departed with the distinct impression that I had witnessed something that crossed the boundaries of both law and nature. Parish records indicate that 9 marriages were arranged that night, with significant sums changing hands. The hidden ledger details the pairings alongside notations about expected outcomes and schedules for progress assessment. Blackwood had created a horrific system of human experimentation under the guise of marriage arrangements, apparently seeking to influence what he termed heritable temperamental qualities. The ledger entry for May 16, 1856, reads, "The selection event proceeded largely as anticipated. 9 specimens were successfully placed with suitable patrons, each committed to the observation and documentation protocols. Lord W. expressed particular interest in the theoretical framework and has invited me to present my findings at his private scientific society in New Orleans next winter. The remaining specimens will be utilized for the control group studies. Preparations for Phase 2 will commence tomorrow." In the weeks following the May 15th event, Josephine's journal entries become increasingly disjointed. "There are sounds from the old Indigo building at night," she wrote on June 2nd. "Thaddeus says it is merely the wind, but the wind does not cry out in a woman's voice. He does not know I have seen the small room behind his study, with its walls of charts and diagrams, the samples of hair tied with string, the vials of blood labeled by date and subject number. Her entry from June 10th is particularly troubling. I confronted him this morning about the cries in the night. For the first time since our marriage, he spoke to me with complete candor. He claims to be developing methods to influence not just physical traits, but the very nature of human character through what he terms selective breeding and environmental conditioning. He spoke of creating improved human bloodlines, with the same enthusiasm he once discussed irrigation techniques for the South Fields. When I suggested his work might violate God's natural order, he looked at me with such contempt that I scarcely recognized him. "God designed nature to be understood and improved upon by man's reason," he said. "I am merely accelerating the process." He showed me his journals filled with observations and data collected over years. I cannot reconcile the man I married with what he has become, or perhaps always was. On June 23rd, she wrote her final entry, "I cannot bear another night of knowing. The scratching at my door grows louder. He whispers that I will understand soon that I too have a role in his great work. I have mixed the remainder of my laudanum with the evening tea. If God has mercy, it will be enough." According to the coroner's report filed in West Feliciana Parish records, Josephine Blackwood died on June 24, 1856, from an overdose of laudanum. The death was ruled a suicide. Thaddeus Blackwood arranged a modest funeral, attended primarily by household staff rather than members of society. He did not appear to mourn publicly, and according to a note in Dr. Claiborne's records, displayed a curious detachment, as though his mind were occupied with matters he considered more pressing than his wife's passing. Dr. Claiborne's private diary, discovered among his papers after his death in 1887 and now held in the Louisiana Medical Historical Society archives, contains a more detailed and disturbing account. "I was called to Ellerslie upon the discovery of Mrs. Blackwood's body by her lady's maid. Upon my arrival I found Thaddeus already in the process of cataloging her personal effects with the same methodical precision he brings to all matters. When I expressed condolences, he responded with an observation about the predictability of melancholic temperaments under sustained stress and inquired whether I would permit an autopsy for his research purposes. I refused in the strongest terms. As I prepared to depart, he made a most unsettling remark. Her contribution to the advancement of knowledge need not end with her death. I left immediately and have since declined all further invitations to Ellerslie. Following Josephine's death, Blackwood withdrew almost completely from parish society. Tax records show he sold a portion of Ellerslie's cultivated land to neighboring plantations, reducing agricultural operations significantly while maintaining the main house and outbuildings. Delivery records from Baton Rouge merchants show increased orders for scientific equipment, chemicals, and medical supplies, along with unusual items such as specialized restraints described as for medical purposes and custom glassware from a Philadelphia manufacturer known for supplying universities and research institutions. In the months following Josephine's death, Blackwood's activities accelerated. Records from nearby plantations note increased seclusion and unusual patterns of behavior. The hidden ledger entries from this period show increasingly erratic handwriting and references to breakthroughs imminent and the final phase of selection. An entry dated July 15, 1856 reads, "The conditioning protocol for the second-generation specimens has been refined. By beginning the process before birth through maternal exposure to the chemical compound and auditory stimuli, the subjects show markedly increased receptivity. Preliminary results from the first 3 pairings are promising. The offspring display the anticipated temperamental characteristics within the first months of life. Most significant is the complete absence of resistance behaviors observed in adult subjects. The implications are profound." A page dated August 2 contains diagrams of what appears to be specialized equipment for administering gases and controlling environmental conditions, alongside notes about optimizing suggestibility through sensory manipulation. Blackwood wrote, "The human mind, properly prepared, becomes as malleable as clay. The application of precisely timed stimuli during critical developmental periods appears to permanently alter behavioral patterns. The potential applications extend far beyond my initial hypotheses." During this period, Blackwood maintained correspondence with the plantation owners who had participated in the May auction. A letter from William Garland of Greenwood Plantation, dated July 28, 1856, and preserved in the Garland family papers at Tulane University, reads, "The woman acquired from your establishment continues to exhibit the unusual qualities you described. Her docility and complete absence of the typical resistance behaviors has been remarked upon by all who observe her. I have followed your documented protocols precisely and anticipate the birth of the first subject in approximately 6 months. I remain skeptical of some aspects of your theories, but cannot deny the effectiveness of your methods. Please forward the additional compounds you mentioned at our last meeting." In August 1856, several enslaved persons from Ellerslie escaped and sought refuge at neighboring plantations. Their testimonies were recorded by Reverend Thomas Willoughby of St. Francisville's Episcopal Church, who was sufficiently disturbed to contact authorities in Baton Rouge. According to Willoughby's letter, preserved in church archives, the escapees spoke of rituals conducted at night and women who disappeared after their marriages, only to be replaced by others. They described Blackwood as a man possessed, speaking to himself and conducting bizarre examinations of those selected for his special attention. Willoughby's letter continues, "The accounts provided by these unfortunate souls describe practices that, were they not corroborated by multiple witnesses, I would dismiss as fevered imagination. They speak of women kept in rooms with walls painted in hypnotic patterns, exposed to strange vapors that induced trance-like states, and subjected to repetitive sounds and phrases for hours. Most disturbing are the descriptions of Blackwood's selection room, where he supposedly recorded responses to various stimuli, including pain, fear, and unusual visual presentations, noting which women displayed the characteristics he sought. Those who failed his tests were reportedly sent away in the night, their destinations unknown. I am not a man given to sensationalism, but I cannot in good conscience ignore these reports, which suggest activities beyond the already troubling practices of human bondage. Parish records indicate that a magistrate and 3 deputies rode to Ellerslie on September 4, 1856, to investigate the allegations. They did not file an official report of their findings. However, the personal diary of Deputy Marshal William Hayes, discovered among his effects after his death in 1879, contained a brief but disturbing entry from that day. "What we witnessed at Ellerslie shall never pass my lips. We agreed that some horrors are best left buried. Blackwood's work has been destroyed, the evidence burned. May God forgive us for what we could not unsee." A more detailed account of the investigation was discovered in 1965 in a sealed letter Hayes had left with his attorney, to be opened only after his death. The letter, now held in a restricted collection at Louisiana State University, describes entering the old Indigo building. The structure had been transformed into a facility unlike anything I had encountered in 20 years of law enforcement. The central chamber contained an arrangement of chairs facing a pendulum device suspended before a painted spiral pattern. The air retained traces of a sweet chemical odor that induced dizziness in several of our party. Most disturbing were the individual cells along the rear wall, each containing a narrow bed and fitted with restraints. The walls were covered with handwritten mathematical formulas and diagrams of the human brain. In a separate room, we discovered Blackwood's records, meticulously documented observations of what he termed conditioning sessions and breeding results. The language was that of a cattle breeder or dog fancier, yet applied to human beings with a detached precision that chilled the blood. Magistrate Collins instructed us to remove all documentation for evidence, but upon reviewing the materials, he determined that no formal charges could address the nature of Blackwood's activities without creating a scandal beyond imagination. By mutual agreement, we burned all records on site and sealed the building. Collins extracted Blackwood's promise to cease his activities and dismantle the facility, though I observed little remorse in the man's demeanor. He spoke of our limited understanding and the necessary sacrifices for scientific advancement, as though explaining a complex matter to a group of particularly slow-witted. 2 days later, on September 6, 1856, Ellerslie Plantation House caught fire in the middle of the night. The blaze reportedly began in Blackwood's study and spread rapidly through the main house. Thaddeus Blackwood perished in the fire. The official cause was listed as accident, likely from an unattended lamp. However, a letter from Elizabeth Pembroke to her sister suggests another possibility. The authorities say it was an accident, but all in the parish know it could only have been deliberately set. The question that haunts us is whether it was set from outside the house or by Blackwood himself to conceal what he had done. The old Indigo processing building was not damaged in the fire. When neighboring planters arrived to assist, they reported finding it empty, though with evidence of recent occupation. The 9 women married during the May ceremony were never accounted for in any subsequent record. An inventory of Blackwood's estate, conducted for probate purposes, lists standard plantation equipment and household items, with notable omissions. His extensive scientific library, mentioned in multiple accounts, was not catalogued. The specialized equipment observed by the investigating deputies was likewise absent from the inventory. Most significant is a notation by the clerk. The deceased's papers and personal effects appear to have been selectively removed prior to the fire. The study, reported by household staff to have contained numerous journals and scientific instruments, yielded only ashes. Ellerslie remained unoccupied for nearly 2 years following Blackwood's death. When it was eventually purchased by the Henderson family from Mississippi in 1858, they reported numerous difficulties with the property. Servants refused to work there, citing disturbing sounds and a heaviness in the air that made it difficult to breathe. The Hendersons sold the property after just 7 months. Martha Henderson's diary, preserved in the Mississippi State Archives, records, "No one will enter the East Wing after sunset, no matter the inducement offered." The house resists our attempts to make it a home. Wallpaper peels within days of application. Unexplained drafts extinguish candles even when no windows are open, and the scent of chemical preservatives pervades certain rooms despite repeated cleaning. Most troubling are the sounds that emanate from the walls at night. A rhythmic tapping that follows no pattern we can discern, yet conveys an undeniable sense of purpose. My husband claims it is merely the settling of an old house, but I have lived in older homes that did not communicate such dread. Over the following decade, the plantation changed hands repeatedly. Portions of the property were sold off, and the once grand estate fell into disrepair. Local lore began to surround Ellerslie, with residents of St. Francisville avoiding the property, especially after sunset. Children were warned against approaching the old Indigo building, which collapsed during a storm in 1887, though its stone foundation remains visible today. The Chapman family, who owned the property from 1862 to 1863, reported discovering a hidden passage connecting the main house to a small windowless room beneath the former study. According to a letter from Rebecca Chapman to her mother, the room contained only a chair bolted to the floor and walls covered with tally marks scratched into the plaster. Thomas had the entrance sealed immediately, she wrote. The few servants who viewed the room refused to sleep another night on the property and left without collecting their wages. During the Civil War, Ellerslie was briefly used as a field hospital by Confederate forces following the nearby Battle of Port Hudson in 1863. Military records note that wounded soldiers refused to be treated in certain parts of the house, claiming the rooms felt wrong or unnatural. The supervising surgeon, Dr. Elijah Montgomery, wrote in his field journal, "The men exhibit unusual agitation when placed in the eastern chambers. Several have reported identical hallucinations, the sound of a woman weeping, and the sensation of being observed. I have relocated our medical operations to the former stables, which, though less convenient, has resulted in markedly improved morale among both patients and medical staff." After the war, Ellerslie passed into the hands of a succession of owners, none remaining longer than 18 months. The property's reputation spread beyond St. Francisville, featuring in New Orleans newspaper articles about haunted locations of Louisiana in the 1870s and 1880s. While these accounts typically focused on supernatural explanations, local residents maintained a more reserved perspective, speaking of the property as tainted rather than haunted. The true extent of Thaddeus Blackwood's activities might have remained buried forever if not for the discovery of the hidden ledger in 1964. Even then, the full story was deliberately suppressed. Dr. Teau, Margaret Wilborn's notes, partially preserved in the Louisiana State University archives, indicate that she believed Blackwood was conducting a form of eugenics experiment nearly a century before that term entered scientific discourse. The methodical nature of his records, the clinical detachment with which he documented his observations, suggests a man who viewed himself not as committing atrocities, but as conducting scientific inquiry, she wrote. This perhaps is the most disturbing aspect, the use of rationality and systematic approach to conduct acts of profound inhumanity. Wilborn's research notes continue. Blackwood appears to have developed techniques combining chemical compounds, hypnotic suggestion, and environmental conditioning to alter behavior patterns in his subjects. More disturbing is his apparent belief that these induced characteristics could become heritable, that offspring would inherit not just physical traits but psychologically conditioned responses. While scientifically unfounded, his conviction led to increasingly elaborate experiments combining elements of selective breeding with psychological manipulation. The fragmentary nature of the surviving documentation makes it impossible to determine how many individuals were subjected to these procedures, though the ledger suggests at least 26 women were directly involved, with an unknown number of resulting births. The most troubling aspect of the Ellerslie case lies not in the documented events, but in what remains unknown. The fate of the 9 women from the May auction was never established. No graves were found on the property during subsequent renovations and land surveys. The partial decoding of Blackwood's ciphered notes suggests he believed he was developing a method to influence not just physical traits, but temperament and psychological characteristics through controlled breeding and what he termed environmental conditioning. Historians who have studied the limited available evidence suggest that Blackwood may have been influenced by early theories of heredity that predated modern genetics. His library, partially catalogued before the fire, included several volumes on animal husbandry and breeding, as well as some of the earliest works speculating on human heredity. What set his approach apart from the already horrific practices of his time was the methodical pseudo-scientific framework he applied to his cruelty. In 1968, during the last attempted restoration of the Ellerslie main house, workers uncovered a sealed chamber beneath what had been Blackwood's study. According to the contractor's report, the room contained a desk, examination table, and cabinet of specimens preserved in liquid. The parish authorities ordered the chamber resealed without further documentation. The restoration was abandoned shortly thereafter. Bernard Lafitte, one of the workers present at the discovery, gave a brief interview to the Baton Rouge Advocate in 1970. "I've worked construction for 30 years and never encountered anything like what we found at Ellerslie. The room had been sealed with bricks that didn't match the rest of the foundation, newer work. Inside was like a doctor's office from a nightmare. The walls were covered with drawings of human bodies with sections labeled in some kind of code. There was a glass cabinet with jars. I only glimpsed what was inside before the foreman ordered us out, but it looked like preserved organs labeled with numbers and dates. The parish sheriff came out, took one look, and made us swear not to discuss what we'd seen. They poured concrete over the entrance the next day." The lead investigator from the parish sheriff's office, Deputy Richard Holcomb, refused all interviews about the discovery until shortly before his death in 1982. In a single conversation with historian Dr. Alan Pritchard, recorded for the Louisiana Oral History Project, but never publicly released, Holcomb stated, "What we found beneath Ellerslie wasn't just a laboratory. It was evidence of a mind that had abandoned all human consideration in pursuit of a terrible hypothesis." The specimens were preserved human tissue, primarily brain sections, labeled with dates and subject numbers corresponding to entries in Blackwood's ledger. The examination table had restraints positioned to immobilize a person while allowing access to the head. Most disturbing was a set of specialized surgical instruments and a journal detailing procedures I will not describe except to say they were performed on living subjects. We sealed that room as one might seal a tomb, and I have carried the weight of that knowledge ever since. Some history should remain buried. Today, Ellerslie stands empty, its remaining structures slowly reclaimed by the Louisiana vegetation. The property has not been sold since 1967, remaining in legal limbo as part of an estate whose heirs refuse to claim it. Local residents still avoid the area, particularly around the anniversary of the May auction or Josephine's June suicide. A psychological assessment of Thaddeus Blackwood, compiled in 1966 by Dr. Eleanor Harding of Tulane University based on his writings and historical accounts, concluded, "The surviving documentation suggests an individual with a highly compartmentalized mind, capable of maintaining rigid separation between conventional moral understanding and scientific obsession." Blackwood exhibited classic traits of what we would now term a psychopathic personality: superficial charm, intelligence, absence of remorse, and a profound inability to view others as fully human. His scientific rationalization of cruelty represents a particularly dangerous variant, as it allowed him to perceive his actions as not merely justified, but noble in their contribution to knowledge. The case of the bride auction at Ellerslie represents a dark chapter in American history, one that combines the institutional horror of slavery with the personal depravity of a man who saw human beings as specimens for experimentation. It stands as a reminder that sometimes the most profound evils are not supernatural, but entirely human in origin. Perhaps most disturbing of all is the systematic erasure of these events from official records. Were it not for the hidden ledger, Josephine's journal, and the scattered correspondence preserved by chance rather than design, this history might have been lost entirely, buried beneath layers of silence and deliberate forgetting. For those who study the Ellerslie case, one question remains particularly troubling. Was Thaddeus Blackwood truly unique in his methods, or merely more methodical in his documentation? How many other such cases might have existed, their records destroyed or never created, their victims forgotten by a history that often averts its gaze from the most disturbing aspects of our collective past? Dr. Margaret Wilborn's final research note, written before she abandoned her academic career, reads, "The horror of Ellerslie lies not in its exceptionality, but in its logical extension of existing systems. Blackwood did not create his methodology in isolation. He merely applied scientific rhetoric and procedure to practices already normalized by the institution of slavery. His records speak repeatedly of improving the stock and enhancing value through selective breeding, terms commonly used throughout the plantation economy. His innovation was not in concept, but in method and documentation. This raises the profoundly disturbing possibility that Blackwood represents not an aberration, but merely a more visible example of practices that may have been more widespread than historical records acknowledge." In 1965, a graduate student in anthropology visited the remains of Ellerslie as part of research into plantation architecture. In her field notes, she recorded that the property emanates a profound sense of wrongness that defies rational explanation. Standing among the ruins of the main house as sunset approached, I became convinced I was being observed from the tree line. More unsettling still was the sensation of soil shifting beneath my feet, as though something long buried were stirring after decades of stillness. The most recent documented visit to Ellerslie took place in 1968, when a team from the Louisiana Historical Preservation Society conducted a final assessment before abandoning preservation efforts. Their report concluded with an unusual personal note from the team leader. "This site should remain undisturbed. Some places absorb the events that transpire within their boundaries. Ellerslie has not forgotten what happened there, even if we have tried to." The parish records office in St. Francisville contains a curious notation, added in 1968 and never removed despite lacking official authorization. Inquiries regarding Ellerslie Plantation property, West Feliciana Parish, Section 12, are to be directed to the State Historical Commission. Local office maintains no records pertaining to this location. A local newspaper publisher who attempted to investigate the Ellerslie story in 1972 reported receiving anonymous letters warning against publication. "I have lived in St. Francisville all my life," he told a colleague at the New Orleans Times-Picayune, "and never encountered such universal reluctance to discuss a local matter. People who will happily share the most scandalous family histories fall silent at the mention of Ellerslie." It's as though the community made a collective decision to excise this particular chapter from memory. The 9 plantation owners who participated in Blackwood's May 1856 auction have proven difficult to identify with certainty. Historical records suggest that within 5 years of the event, all had either died, relocated from Louisiana, or suffered financial ruin. The most complete account comes from the diary of Rebecca Thornton, wife of planter James Thornton, who wrote in 1859, "James has not been himself since his involvement with that dreadful Blackwood affair. He refuses to discuss what transpired at Ellerslie, but the experience changed him profoundly. He has abandoned his previous interest in scientific agriculture and speaks often of selling our property and relocating to Europe. Most concerning are the nightmares that plague him. He wakes screaming about the women with empty eyes and children without souls. No amount of laudanum grants him peaceful rest. What remains of Thaddeus Blackwood's bride auction is fragmentary, pieces of a horror deliberately obscured by those who encountered it. The women who suffered under his experiments remain nameless in most records, their fates unrecorded. In remembering this history, We honor those victims and acknowledge that the most profound darkness often hides in plain sight, behind facades of respectability and rationality. As we conclude this account, consider that the elegant homes and manicured gardens of the antebellum South sometimes concealed horrors beyond our modern comprehension. The bride auction of Ellerslie was not supernatural. It required no ghosts, no ancient curses, only the capacity of humans to view other humans as objects, as specimens, as means to an end. And perhaps that is why the story of Ellerslie was so deliberately buried, not because it was too fantastic to believe, but because it was too human, too possible, too reflective of capacities that exist within the spectrum of human behavior. The true horror of Ellerslie is not that it was exceptional, but that it was, in its way, an extension of the everyday brutality of the society that made it possible. Visitors to St. Francisville today will find no markers or plaques commemorating the events at Ellerslie. The property appears on no historical tours. It is an emptiness on the map, a place remembered primarily through absence rather than presence. As one local historian noted in a private letter from 1968, some histories are not preserved but quarantined. The last known document relating to Ellerslie is a brief note from the Louisiana State Archives, dated October 1968. Materials pertaining to Blackwood Tea and Ellerslie Plantation have been removed from general circulation. Access requires special permission from the director. No record exists of anyone requesting or receiving such permission in the decades since. And so the bride auction of Louisiana, 1856, remains a whisper, a fragment, a horror glimpsed through cracks in the historical record, a reminder that sometimes the past is obscured not through accident or neglect, but through deliberate choice. Some memories are too heavy to carry forward. Some stories resist being fully told. If you find yourself driving through West Feliciana Parish, you might pass an overgrown drive leading into dense woods, marked only by two weathered stone pillars. Local custom says to drive on without slowing. What happened at Ellerslie has faded from official history, but the land remembers, in the words of Deputy Hayes, written in trembling hand on the last page of his diary. Some ground is watered with sorrows too deep to ever run dry.